Say all this to say that USAID, the reason so much of the worst scandals that you find are USAID, and why I always say when it's too dirty for the CIA, you give it to USAID, is because the CIA needs to get presidential approval for every covert action they do. They need to submit there needs to be a presidential finding that they need to do it. USAID does not. And that's how you see all this USAID money flowing to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban groups. I think they just found $122 million from USAID, to them just this week. I guarantee that number is a lot higher than that. It was designed to be a fast, flexible, rapid response capacity for USAID to do regime change work, to do political stabilization, to basically do sort of a kind of civilian special forces for civil, military, and political warfare work that would not have to run the traditional traps of approval. It wouldn't be bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. Most of the major CIA scandals of the past 2 decades have not actually been the CIA directly themselves. In 1993, USAID created this new office to help wage the post-Cold War political warfare, initially in Eastern Europe, after we were trying to create political vassal states out of the former Soviet colonies in Eastern Europe. And this was called the Office of Transition Initiatives, OTI, USAID OTI. And it was designed to be a fast, flexible, rapid response capacity for USAID to do regime change work, to do political stabilization, to basically do sort of a kind of civilian special forces for civil, military, and political warfare work that would not have to run the traditional traps of approval. It wouldn't be bogged down in bureaucratic red tape, and it would effectively function under cover of humanitarian work as being a CIA, but without having the limitations that the CIA has on needing White House approval through what's called a presidential finding. So all these CIA scandals popped off in the 1960s and 70s. The CIA went through a bunch of reforms. This was the famous Church Committee and Pike Committee hearings of 1975 and 1976. First time the U.S. ever created a Senate Intelligence Committee, a House Intelligence Committee, to permanently oversee the CIA, to stop what it had been doing, domestic political targeting at that time of left-wing Democrats, from ever happening again. Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election because of these scandals. And immediately, his first year in office, carried out the famous Halloween massacre that laid off 30% of the CIA operations division in a single night and crippled their budget. By the way, tell me if that sounds familiar to what's happening right now, the first month of the Trump admin. Mm-hmm. Won the office because of political scandals from intelligence, agency oversight, hits them right away. But then Carter ran into the Iran hostage situation. The national security state, the media, Ronald Reagan blamed blamed Jimmy Carter neutering the CIA for having caused that. If we had the CIA that we had before, the Iran hostage situation would have never happened. And so there was still a black eye at CIA to get those old powers back, but the Reagan administration wanted those powers, so they couldn't get it through Congress. So what they did is they basically created new structures to do what used to be done by the CIA, to be done by places like USAID and their newly created 1983 National Endowment for Democracy, who is effectively the operations arm of much of USAID work. And I say all this to say that USAID, the reason so much of the worst scandals that you find are USAID, and why I always say when it's too dirty for the CIA, you give it to USAID, is because the CIA needs to get presidential approval for every covert action they do. They need to submit there needs to be a presidential finding that they need to do it. USAID does not. Which means if a rogue cell at CIA or Special Forces or some wing of the State Department wants to do a dirty deed and they know the president won't approve, or in fact targets directly or indirectly the president or his international allies, they know they can't get the presidential finding, but it has to be a covert action to run. The world can't find out they're doing it or what these grantees are actually doing. All they need to do is walk next door or place a phone call or, meet in a secure location and tell their friends at USAID, and USAID can make the whole thing happen totally, basically behind the president's back. And I can go through a bunch of examples of that, but that's how Trump got hoodwinked in Term 1.0 by his own USAID.
So basically, USAID is a proxy arm for CIA, Department of State, the Bureau, DHS, all these type intelligence organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the great flexible swingman for any of their needs.
So how do they keep from having any oversight?
Well, this is the magic of being a independent agency. See,
is it an NGO?
No, it's a formal U.S. government agency, but they make grants and subgrants and contracting work out to the NGO class. But it's an independent agency. There's a great U.S. Army War College book / extended white paper that I've been publishing receipts from for the past 6 months, and it's from 2014, and it's called the DoD and USAID an analysis and recommendations for development defense cooperation going forward, and it looks at this relationship between DoD, state, and USAID, and it compiles DoD senior leadership thoughts on how best to synchronize what they call defense, diplomacy, development, the 3 Ds all working together, the military, the State Department, and USAID, because DoD has national security interests in the region, state has national interest or economic interest in the region. They need assets to play with, assets to liaise with, assets to build up, and development creates those assets, paying to create these institutions, paying to co-opt these institutions. So these things all go together. These three Ds: defense, diplomacy, development. This is 2014. This is over a decade ago. And in that U.S. Army War College memo, there's quotes from U.S. generals that say that they prefer working with USAID over state, even though USAID is independent, but it's always supposed to be guided by state, because even our humanitarian assistance has to serve U.S. interests. And state represents those stated interests. But you have DoD people over a decade ago saying they prefer to work with USAID over state for several reasons. That USAID is not bogged down by bureaucratic red tape of the quote interagency knife fight that happens in the National Security Council, but that USAID quote actually does stuff, whereas state is hamstrung by what they can actually do. It's a diplomatic incident if the formal diplomatic arm of the U.S. State Department does something versus an independent aid agency that is there on a humanitarian purpose, and they were using it for this wrong purpose. And because there's much more oversight on state. State runs the interagency gauntlet every day of its existence. It has to persuade the White House, the White House National Security Council and all the interagency partners to do something. But really the only oversight there is at USAID is what's happened is at the Office of Inspector General level, their own in-house accountability mechanism. And there's some great examples of how this has gone so haywire. I don't mean to...
Keep going.
Okay. There's a massive scandal for USAID, and everyone can look this up. It was the Zunzuneo scandal. And let me make clear out the gate that I do not like, and I'm not a fan of the Cuban government. I don't believe in socialism. I don't believe in communism. I'm not saying what I'm about to say because I believe that the Cuban government should remain or whatnot. I'm leave aside the moral question about whether or not this was the right or wrong thing to do. But here is what was done. In 2014, a very massive scandal popped off that I think few people today remember. This was during the Biden White House, where USAID took humanitarian funds that were earmarked for Pakistan and used them, we are told, to unilaterally create a social media website in Cuba at a time when Cuba had banned U.S. social media, considering Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and the like to be arms of U.S. statecraft. The Obama administration was riding high at this moment from the Arab Spring. and the Facebook revolutions and the Twitter revolutions that USAID and NED played such a critical role in, funding money to these networks, training them, teaching them how to use Twitter hashtags, teaching them how to coordinate Facebook posts to tell people where to protest. $1.2 billion pumped in by the State Department in Egypt during that time, for example. And so what USAID and their own internal documents showed is that they saw the success of the Arab Spring, and they wanted to create a Cuban Spring. They wanted street protests, riots, what they called smart mobs in Cuba on the basis of U.S. social media that they could instrumentalize. The problem was they didn't have the asset in the region. They couldn't get their social media in. So what they did is they used a Byzantine labyrinth of money laundering flows from these humanitarian aids earmarked for Pakistan, again, back to Pakistan, and used that to go through a subcontractor called Creative Associates International, who's a frequent USAID contractor for this dirty work. They were involved in all sorts of other ones, but it's CAI, not CIA, Creative Associates International, who then basically contacted two Cuban businessmen to create a identical version of Twitter, but for Cubans. And it was Zunzanillo is Cuban for hummingbird. It's basically even simulated the bird. It had the like button, the retweet button, and the USAID documents showed that their plan was to get about 100,000, recruit people onto this platform, in their own words, with algorithms and feeds and promotion of that this was the site to share sports, music, and hurricane updates. That's their direct phrase in their own internal documents. But that once they had gotten a critical mass of users on the site, between like 60,000 and 100,000, they would shift the algorithms, they would use the data that they hoovered up from Cubans signing up, taking note of their political proclivities, the network clusters they'd formed, in order to get them to take to the streets in a violent revolution protest against the Cuban government, to form what they called smart mobs. And basically, at the appropriate moment, once they'd got them in, to get them to overthrow their government. Now, this is a classic CIA covert action. This has massive diplomatic implications for the United States government if this kind of thing is revealed. That's why the CIA is in charge of this stuff, because the CIA is the political warfare arm of the State Department. The State Department maintains our diplomatic relations and posture with the foreign world. The reason USAID is not supposed to be doing covert action, the CIA is because if there's diplomatic blowback, it should be diplomatic organs who are doing it. But what USAID said, so evidently there was no presidential finding for that. They ran it, so without President Obama's approval, at least that's the official story. And when Senate staffers during the oversight could not get access, so the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said they were duped. The interagency of the White House said they were duped. The official story, and they had public hearings on this, by the way, I believe in 2014. The official story is that USAID did this whole thing in-house, and they did it because it was so-called discreet rather than covert. That it was not a formal covert action; it was simply discreet democracy promotion work to bring democracy to Cuba. But if they ran that in the Obama administration, imagine what was done. Trump wanted to knock out ISIS. ISIS, according to the previous White House, we have WikiLeaks emails of Jake Sullivan saying to Hillary Clinton, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, and that effectively, ISIS was a useful friend against Bashar al-Assad. Trump wants to knock out ISIS. Hey, how do you fund money to ISIS if the president wants to eradicate ISIS, if you still want to use them as assets in the region? Well, you're not going to get interagency approval if the CIA does it, a covert action. What if USAID does it? And that's how you see all this USAID money flowing to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Taliban groups. I think they just found $122 million from USAID, to them just this week. I guarantee that number is a lot higher than that. And in fact, Trump's White House, Trump's OIG, who just took over USAID before this recent action, just published a memo where he said, and this is unbeknownst to the entire American public until now, that actually there's a big fat loophole at USAID where their contractors evidently don't need to, and there may be a technical, everyone can read that OIG report. John Solomon at Just the News published all of this. But effectively, USAID can look the other way because there are no restrictions on their contractors in terms of their OFAC and counterterrorism money flow throughs, or at least there's giant loopholes in them. So USAID can fund terrorist groups and get away with it in a way that no other U.S. government agency can.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.